With that, I would like to welcome our guest presenter today. We have with us a very special guest, Steve Quis, who's going to talk to us about some of the things that we can do to improve our chances of getting a story from the media. And Steve has so much experience. I think I'll just let you introduce yourself, Steve.
Sure.
You're a morning person, so take it away.
All right. Well, hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. I appreciate you coming and spending a half hour or 40 minutes, whatever it's going to be. My main job right now is Public Information Officer for San Diego Miramar College. I've been doing that now for 5.5 years, so this is my 6th year here. But my background is I graduated from the University of Arizona with a degree in media arts back in the early 90s when it was, totally different. We didn't have social media and all that stuff. It was just basically radio, television, newspapers, and then kind of progressed through 10 years working in Tucson, Arizona at a television station, and then another 10, well, now it's been 20 years working in San Diego. So one of my other jobs too is that I'm one of the sports anchors at KFMB Channel 8 here in San Diego, and have been doing that since 2010. So I'm active in a newsroom, and I really know what people what people pitch and what works and what doesn't work. As a matter of fact, this holiday weekend, I actually had a chance to anchor a couple of days in COVID from my home, which was the first time I've ever done that. And then I anchor, I think next weekend, next Friday and Saturday as well. So been very active member of the media. So what I take to heart what I say, because like I said, I see this, I just checked my KFMB email and I get pitch after pitch after pitch. And a lot of them, and we'll go into the reasons why, it's just like delete, delete, delete. And then one that might catch my attention, which is what we want to make your pitches do, I'll wind up reading. So I might get in one day anywhere from 10 to 20 pitches, and some days I might not read any of them. Some days I might read one, and there's always that gatekeeper, whether it's radio, TV, social media. So that's kind of the person you want to get to. So that's my background. I also worked 6 years in Major League Baseball as a Padre announcer and an Angel announcer. And then this is my 10th year actually kind of hedging my bets and working for a college in education. And so I have kind of I've been on both sides, and I'm still actively on both sides, how to pitch, how to receive pitches too. So the goal obviously is going to be, teach you how to launch a successful media pitch, the gatekeepers to get to, who to talk to. A lot of times we're not ever taught when not to reach out to somebody. So that's probably one of the things that I'm going to stress to you today with some examples is when not to reach out to people, which if there's one thing you can learn, it's that, right, is when you're being bothersome, because you certainly do not want to be that bothersome person that when you get to Steve Quis's emails, it's like boom, 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 boom. And that's what we've done a really good job at Miramar College, and what the media knows best about me is I'm not going to pitch everything. They're not going to get everything. My bosses aren't always happy about that, but I think what you need to do and what I do very well is when people hear from me, they know it's going to be a pretty good story, because I know what a good story is going to be. Like we had Billy's here. I see Billy here. We did a story with Billy the other day, and I'll tell you how that came about and that pitching. And I'll explain that to you here in a minute. But so the goal for a good pitch would be, is for some businesses is to get awareness, right? You're in entrepreneurship, so you're going to start a new business, whether it's a restaurant, an app or what have you, you want to start building your brand, and that's key. And these things take time. You can have a boss. Managing expectations of your bosses is also something we're going to discuss too. You have to understand that it takes time to build that brand. We're still doing it at Miramar College in my 6th year here, and we still have, I think, another probably 10 years to go before we're going to catch up to the Mesas and the Palomars and all that. I used to drive by every day on my way to, whether it was KUSI or the Padres or KFMB, and I'd go down I-15 from my house, and I'd always see the Miramar College sign, and I'd be like, I wouldn't even have a second thought about it. I didn't know what it was, didn't care to know what it was, and I would assume there is probably 1 million people a day driving down doing the same thing. So when I came to Miramar, it was time to try and change that and to build a brand and to get on and take every little small increment we could to build the brand. So that's kind of the goal of a good pitch. It's to help to build your brand, and the coverage that you can get, even the smallest thing, you can reposition on your websites, you can reposition on social media, you can use it and continue to use it down so that customers all of a sudden see your legitimacy. And so one thing we do is we always put it when we get a good story like Billy's that we had 2 weeks ago, you know, we reposition that out on social media. We put it in a newsroom so people come by and see. And so I envision for you when you're just starting an entrepreneurship company, let's say it's a restaurant or something, and it's a cool restaurant where you can eat nachos and then you can go in this room where you fly up, like one of those things you see in Las Vegas, right? So it's something totally different. It's a bar restaurant where they have a mechanical bull and driving up, right? And you can fly up. And so if you have your website and you get 4 or 5 good stories, right, when people come to your website, they can click on the stories and they can see, and that will help legitimize your brand. And that's sort of kind of what we do at Miramar College on a little bit bigger scale. And it's free. I mean, that's the key thing, right? For advertising, we pay a lot in advertising, probably $50,000, $60,000 a year to advertise Miramar College to try and drive our enrollments. But if we get a good pitch and something that we can reposition, we could get anywhere from $50,000 to $100,000 in just free advertising. And that's like Billy, like the story of Billy retraining during COVID, after, you know, changes to her job status at her other place. That goes a long way in helping us, right? People see that story and they say, oh, I could do like Billy does. And that's key for us. So that's what we're trying to do here for you, is to legitimize your brand, to get you a few things early going when you build your website and your social media that people will see and go, okay, these people are legitimate. So here are some keys to this. So now we know what the goals are in my background, but I think one of the keys is sometimes the best pitch, and I just mentioned that, is the one that you don't make. And so I've been doing this a long time. I know what reporters want to see. I know what stations want to see. For instance, Channel 8 that I work at KFMB, it's really hard to get a story on there unless it's a really good people story or it's a story about animals, okay? Doesn't matter what the animal does. If it's about an animal, boom. So it's on no matter what. And I understand that about them. With Channel 10, I understand that it's a crime story, which thankfully we don't have many of those, right? And quite frankly, I'm not going to pitch on behalf of the college if we have crimes and stuff, and you shouldn't pitch on behalf of your business either. Or they love money stories like money's not the key word, but like how to save you money, right? They're the consumer station. So we did Billy's story, which was about retraining in this program. They did a story on my daughter last year, who will finish high school with 33 units at Miramar College and has basically will transfer into the San Diego State system, or the Cal State system, with a year already done. So you multiply that, right? What is it per unit? I mean, she saved a year, and with housing and all that, it's probably saved the family $25,000, $30,000. They like stories like that. You know, NBC7 will sort of run anything. KUSI has a lot of time to kill, so they're going to listen openly to a lot of stories. The Union Tribune is really hard. To be quite honest with you, the education reporter, when I first got here, would write anything that we wanted. And it was great, and we got on. They changed out to a new guy, and he's a little tough. And anytime we pitch him, what we pitch him might not be what he winds up writing. So we were really growing, and the Union Tribune wanted to talk to us about our growth, and we sort of got fooled. We thought, oh, they're going to write a nice story about Miramar College and how we've grown, and we've had all these bond issues, and we're big, and now we've hit 10,000 students. And then when the story came out, it was actually about how bad City College has been and how they're in debt and all that stuff. And so then, you know, then the chancellor's not happy with us and our bosses are not happy. So there's a little bit of that. So the key thing is the pitch that you don't send. And the reason why I say this to you is because even if you're not an entrepreneur and you get a job like me, sometimes you have to manage the expectations of your bosses, which are key. And so we had a boss here before for our first 5 or 6 years here that wanted everything on television, especially when our enrollments were low, right? We'd have low enrollments in English. And that's not a story for the local media. It's just not a story. So, you know, but they want those news releases out. So a lot of what we do, and what I would say is, if you have an entrepreneur, if you have a business that has a website, create a news section, a newsroom in there where you can write something that you're not necessarily going to pitch to the media, but that you will have for an archive, that you will have on your website if people want to see that. We do a lot of that. I mean, most of the news releases that I write, if I do 100 in a year, I probably only pitch about only pitch about 20% of them to the media. Because if I pitch those other 80, like we talked, after a while, they're going to see it and they're going to go, I just don't want to deal with it. So when people see stuff from me, they know that it's going to be a good story. And in the case of Billy's story, I pitched that story of my daughter to Channel 10, the consumer station, right? They loved it. And we pitched another one to them about some sort of saving money doing something. I don't remember exactly what it was. And then all of a sudden they called me about Billy. They, then they're like, okay, now we know here's the guy that's going to give us a good story, and let's find out what it is. And working with Tanya, and it took us a couple of days, right? We found 5 people to pitch, and they chose Billy, did a wonderful story. And then another reporter at Channel 10 saw it and took those same 5 names that we pitched, and they're going to do a story on someone else doing the same thing. So then it's kind of snowball. So that's what we want to get you to, but it takes time to do that. So if you can remember anything from this, it would be the fact that some of the best pitches are the ones that you don't make, that you feel in your heart. You're like, no, nobody's going to listen to this. And then I'm going to be that guy that's just, every day, oh, here's another thing from Steve, forget it. And then when you have something good, they're not going to listen to you. So that's key. And that takes a long time. I mean, that took me 20 years in a newsroom, watching news, figuring it out. Now you can figure it out on your own by watching, who leans one way, right? We know if you're doing this on a national level, Fox is going to want those right-wing stories. If it's, CNN, they're going to be to the left, and that's advanced pitching that, is sort of above my pay grade. Big brands are sort of the exception to this. Like the city, like fire, police, state, sports teams, they can basically send whatever they want, and it's going to wind up getting on the air. It's just that way. And until you build that brand, it's just think about it that way. I mean, they can send out whatever they want, police, fire, all that good stuff. My philosophy when you actually do a pitch is just keep it short. In this day and age, we're all sort of just the Twitter mentality, right? 140 characters, about all we can handle. And if we want to click on the link to read the story, we can. And then most of us, I'm sure like you, will read half the story and just be like, whatever. So if you keep it short, you've got a better chance. And what I mean by that is if you're going to send out a news release or a news summary, 1 page, and that's it. I mean, you don't want to go into page 2. I get so many of these that are 5 or 6. They're like the Unabomber's manifesto. And, nobody wants to read any of that stuff. So your best stuff up front, keep it as short, summarize it in 1 page. And then if you do get some feedback, and even if you don't get some feedback, make sure that when you send it out, you sort of have your bases covered in that you have a human interest story to connect to it, because that's going to be the key thing. In the case of Billy's story with Channel 10, it's easy for us to tell Channel 10, hey, we have a lot of people retraining, right? There are people being laid off. Here are the Bureau of Labor statistics and stuff. But unless we have that human interest story of like a Billy, they're not going to cover it because it's going to be very hard for them to do that. So you certainly want the human interest side of it. And you need to be very, very strategic. After you have someone that gives you testimonial, I wouldn't pitch anything that's not really in the news cycle. And this is a perfect example to tell you what the news cycle is, right? You'd be crazy right now if you were an entrepreneur to pitch anything that wasn't linked to COVID or social justice right now. You just won't get on the air. You won't. I mean, that's the only 2 stories they're doing. So you've got to be very intuitive into what is going on and try and model your pitches towards that. It might be a little different when you have a business, but if you're smart, you can think about it. You can see something on the news that might hook your business up with the news, the newspapers, social media folks. So that's, I think, a very key thing too, is to not go out there and push your restaurant in the middle of this, unless the key about your new restaurant was that you're hitting all the safety protocols, right? Or, here's the reason why Panera is shut down, but we're not shut down, right? Because we've done this. And so they'll bite. Or again, you could always go with the animal story, right? I mean, everybody loves stories about animals. So if you have a business about pets, you're golden. You're gonna get all the PR that you want. You also have to know. We talked a little bit about gatekeepers too. You sort of need to know your demos. And what I mean by that is if let's say you start your business in Missoula, Montana. When you send out your news release, your gatekeeper is likely going to be a kid right out of college, right? 24, 23, just trying to do a story, move on to the next big market. San Diego or LA, it might be a little bit tougher. You might be in San Diego in our newsrooms. You are talking to a lot of young kids right out of college because it's sort of going that way. But at the newspapers, they're a little more older adults. Some of the folks in the news here in this town or LA that run the show, news directors and stuff are probably going to be, they'll be older and more experienced. And if you can get to them, that's great. But if you keep a running list of the gatekeepers and the journalists, and it's hard to get, of the people that you need to get the news release to, that's key. A lot of times you don't want to send it to a reporter because they just want to do their story, get it done, and get home to their family. And a lot of times they're sort of lazy. And they want someone to tell them what story to do. So a lot of times executive producers at radio stations and TV stations or assignment editors are the ones that sort of get it. Also timing's pretty key too. I mean, anything that you send out, you should probably send out in the morning, earlier in the news cycle. I mean, you do not want to send anything out at 3 or 4 in the afternoon unless you're a city and it's breaking news, right? A murder suspect or something. But if you're looking for some free publicity and something nice, get it out early in the day or get it out late in the day for the morning show guys, right? And for most of you, if you're building a business, you're probably going to want to be on the morning shows more than anything else, right? Because that's your customers are going to be there. There's going to be a lot of women watching that control the pocketbooks and the families and stuff. And you'll have more time, right, to come on. I mean, Tanya's been on set at KUSI probably a dozen times, right? And I would say 10 of those 12 times you've probably been in the morning, right?
It's always in the morning. Yep.
Yeah. Back, and KUSI is the funniest one because they always come in. I'll bring in one of our faculty or something, and we'll come in and they'll be like, hey, you have 3 minutes. And I can tell we're going to speak for 12. Because I can hear, there's only some of these TV stations and radio stations have like 3 employees for 9 hours of news. And you can hear the guy in the back who's not ready with the next story edited. So they're like, just go, go, go.
Up time.
A situation like that, that happens quite a bit. So, know your demos in a smaller town. The kids are going to be younger. They're going to be more impressionable. You probably have an easier time. Bigger city, more adults that might, and some of the top ones, the New York Times, LA Times, they're gonna vet all that down, your story and your release if it gets to them. Chances are in a lot of other places they're not. They might just run with it. So,
Steve, can I interrupt with a question? I know I want to make sure to ask this. It's, when you're talking about knowing the demos and the gatekeepers, would you recommend maybe getting in contact with the younger journalists who don't have maybe don't have a lot of stories in their pipeline, and maybe more likely to want to, I don't know, I just don't know if those would be ones to go after, or like how do you pick is what I'm wondering.
I think you sort of needed to. I don't think reporters are going to look at a lot of that stuff. To be quite honest with you, because they're just going to be the day that I would as a sports guy, because I have to sort of set up my own day. But most news reporters are going to be told what to cover from their assignment desks. So if you have a chance to get in with an assignment desk, that's huge. And if they ever do give you a story, send them a bottle of wine or a 6-pack of beer or a thank you note or something like that, because they love that. They will always, air to you when they or defer to you when they need a story. And the other thing too is that that just triggered me when I was talking about bringing Tanya and other professors to studios. If you can, this is key too, if you can develop faculty as an expert or someone in your business as an expert, that's really key too, because then they'll wind up calling you, and that's really key. And the one place that does it really good is Mesa College within our district, because they have Carl Luna, who is their political science guy that they've pitched for years. I mean, going back 20, 30 years, he's always been the guy that they call. And so, you know, the phone just rings and it's like, we need Carl here to talk about this. And there's been a lot of political stuff for Carl to talk about, and he likes it, right? Because they probably pay him a little stipend. The PR people like it because it helps build your brand, right? And so Mesa's sort of known as the Carl Luna area. University of San Diego is known for, I wish I could remember the professor's name. Maybe Tanya can help me out. He's sort of the economist that they all talk to.
Yeah, I know who, I can picture his face.
He's an Asian gentleman.
I don't know his name. I don't know his name.
So if there's, you know, when there was issues when we had a huge, the economic downturn, right? They were always talking to him, or when housing prices go up. So if you have a business, whereas you can take someone within your business and be an expert to a station, that's great brand management for you. Where, you know, like right now, if I was a restaurant, I would pitch my guy as being the expert on cleanliness and how we reopen and everything, right? If I'm Panera, I'm like, here's our director of how we go back to business, whatever that is, and just move that guy on the radio, you know, on television. So when they're shutting us down and reopening us in 3 weeks, and this is happening in bars, you go right to this guy. Hey, what are they telling you? Because from my understanding is like Panera, I go there every morning. They were told at like 10:30 at night when they were all off, they got an email that said they were closed starting tomorrow for 3 weeks. And then they got the news cycle's got to tell people about that. They've got to let their employees know. So if you could build a sort of I always call it faculty as expert, because that's what we do on the education side. I mean, that's a key, that's a good way in, right? Because what you want is you want them starting to call you, right? So that's what they do at Channel 10. That's what they do at KUSI. It also helps us a little bit too, because we spend some money on the advertising side. So we can sort of, you know, hey, we can elbow them to, you know, come do a story on us. We pay some money. It's, you know, it's just kind of the way the world works. So that's key. Again, we talked about the newsroom, right, on your websites. And then if you get a pitch through, and, you know, sometimes you will, and sometimes they'll just call out of the blue and they, you know, you sent them a pitch 4 weeks ago and now all of a sudden they want to do the story. That happens quite a bit. Just be ready, be patient with them, be prepared, sort of have all your ducks in order, and be very, very flexible. You know, a lot of times we just had a story 2 Mondays ago about the Hugs and Bags, which is a food distribution that we do at Miramar College. And we pitched KFMB. I know this reporter really well. He comes every 6 months and does a story because I kind of saved the really good stuff for him. And this was a good emotional story. And when we got there, unfortunately, the food wasn't there. And so it was like, uh-oh. And he wanted somebody, he also wanted to have a testimonial from somebody, and that person sort of showed up. Now, it did work to our advantage because we had done a dry run the week before the food showed up, and we were only getting like 3 cars at a time. When the food didn't show up for an hour, there was a line 200 cars deep out on the Black Mountain. And he was like, oh my God, this is the greatest story in the world. Like, look how many people want their food. And so it worked to our advantage. But it was because we were flexible, we were prepared, you know, we had the testimonial for them, and the story turned out great. I mean, and the people at Hugs and Bags were happy, and everybody was happy, and we got a little pub. Really didn't even turn out to be our story. They were sort of using us as a place from the roundabout, you know, where they could actually give out the food. And we really didn't have, we just kind of helped them have a place and some volunteers and stuff, but it was a win-win for them. And they're a nonprofit. And the first thing she did was take that story and put it on the front of her website, and then told us that like 2 other companies came to her and said, hey, I'll provide food for you if you want to do 2 more of these. So it's like win-win. And it looked to me like she was a young entrepreneur too, running this, a little bit different, right? Running a nonprofit and that kind of stuff, but sort of it was a win-win for everybody. So so that was good. And the reason why we did that, and if you think about it, like everybody's giving out food right now, right? I mean, that's the key thing is, you know, help your students, help the community and everything. And so there's a billion of those stories out there, but why did they choose us? Well, because I made the call to a reporter that I know, that I have a relationship with. And the first thing I said to him was, hey, Jeff, like, you can tell me no if you have food distribution fatigue. And he was like, nah, let me hear the pitch. And I'm like, this is great. It's hugs and bags. They have lupus. And we just, you gave him that elevator pitch like you guys are working on, right? And he listened to 30 seconds, a minute. And he was like, I'm in, make it work. And then it's up to, me to make it work, that everybody shows up. And you have sleepless nights the night before because you're like, is everyone going to be here? Is the food going to be here? And, we were lucky that the food wasn't there. And then it eventually came, and it made it look like it was a better story. So that's big. Another thing you can do too, as you get deeper to help with the media, you've launched your business, it's been a year, it's been 2 years or something. If you shoot video and have what's called B-roll video for them, they'll love that, where you can just hand them a little disc that says, hey, here's a bunch of video. We do it all the time with Miramar College. It's like if we have a story that they want to pick up about enrollment or something, and they don't want to send someone out to shoot the campus video, we're like, here's a minute of generic campus video. And it's, some of it's with a drone and all that. That really helps them too. What you're trying to do is you're trying to make it, these people are under such immense pressure, having 3 deadlines a day. You want to make them coming to you as comfortable as possible and as less work as possible. And after a while, if they trust you enough, you basically can just tell them what you want them to say, and they will say it. Or they will completely reposition your news, your news release and cut and paste it. I mean, I see it. There's a guy under fire right now at the LA Times for doing that. It's the LA Times, for goodness sake. So if you get good at it, and I still have a ways to go on it, but the more people trust you, the better you can. So that helps them out there. Some roadblocks that I want to make you aware of is when you have a small business, you'll probably want to do the public relations on your own, and you're probably going to be approached by a myriad of agencies that want to help you. And I see this all the time, right? There was a pasta company around the corner on Miramar Way that had a big grand opening. So they spent like $20,000 with an agency, and sure, it got them on a few morning shows and everything, but that's a lot of money to spend for a small business. And so be wary of that. If you're going to do it, because it can give you, those 3 hits on the front of your website that you want, that might be valuable enough to you. I would research those agencies. There's a couple of really good ones here in San Diego. There's one, there's a young woman that does PR, and she's in with all the morning show. Every morning show has that roving reporter that I sort of turn off because it's like, here's the next 13 minutes at the Helen Woodward Animal Shelter, and it's I got the point. Dogs need to be adopted, and it's great. And it's or 9 minutes at the salon or something like that. So there are agencies. Do your homework and research, because if you're going to pay for these agencies, you want to get a lot of bang for your buck. The first company that I worked for in education, we had 2 PR firms. One we paid like $100,000 a month for, that was national. And the next one locally, we paid like regionally $50,000 a month for. And they didn't do anything. I mean, we got a couple of stories on, but that was it. So I don't want you to fall into that. Now, you're likely not going to have that kind of money.
Don't worry. We won't have that problem, right?
Yeah, you're not going to have that. Well, I hope one day you do, actually.
Yeah,
I hope.
right. No, yeah.
Because the first company I worked for was Bridgepoint Education, which owns Ashford and the University of Rockies. And they were small entrepreneurs that lived in this family of a bunch of educators lived in a cul-de-sac, and they were like, hey man, we can buy accreditation from some small college in Iowa and turn it into one of the largest online colleges in the country. And that was their entrepreneurship plan, and they did it. And before you know it, they were worth $6 billion, and they had $150,000 a month to waste on public relations. I hope that's a problem you have one day. It likely won't be, but just do your research when you get into bed or sign with an agency, because it's key. Those smaller agencies are probably going to work harder for you. You might spend a week before you get an agency looking who's on the morning shows, and then make a call and say who placed those ads on the morning shows, because that will certainly help you out. and a lot of times what I find happening is there's sort of payola. I don't know if any of you understand what payola is, but it's, if I were to pay the reporter to come out, cover my story, it's completely illegal. I don't think anybody really checks it anymore, but it was a big thing like in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. But it's still ongoing today, and that happens quite a bit. And I see it a lot on morning shows. Those agencies then will take some of their clients on trips to, or not their clients, but the TV stations to, trips to New York to go see Hamilton and all that kind of stuff. And so there's a lot of that going on. So be wary of that, because you certainly don't want to be outed having hired that agency, and then have some bad PR because of the strategies that they're doing. It happens quite a bit. So because a lot of reporters now, whether it's radio, TV, they do get lazy. They do have intense deadlines, especially with social media, more intense than ever before. Sometimes that's the most important thing. Get it out on social media before you get it into the newspaper, before you get it on the air. So you need to do your research. Anybody have any questions? I see there's chat boxes and.
Oh, I was writing a lot in the chat. I was using it a little bit as for the notes, just so just so that we could keep those key points in our minds. But I don't think we had any questions right now in the chat. So does anybody have any questions that they'd like to go ahead and just ask right now? If not, I have one.
I'll open this up bigger.
I see one coming in, but I have a question.
Yes.
Personally, I've always had a little bit of an issue. I'm a little worried about saying the right thing. And, I'm a big talker, and I say, I don't have much of a filter. I'll say what I think, and it just,
I know.
Yeah. So it gets me into trouble sometimes. And I'm a little worried sometimes about doing like some of the live shows, but even more than the live shows is getting misquoted or, getting a soundbite that was completely out of context with what I was trying to say. Is there anything that you can recommend to do to avoid that?
Well, practice when you go on, right? And you can do mock interviews. There's a lot of media training. A lot of corporations send their execs or their owners to media training so that you're pretty comfortable. There's a lot of people that grow those businesses. But I know exactly what you're saying. And it happens quite a bit. We had an incident about a year ago where that student was taken down for skateboarding, if anybody remembers that, by the police officer right there in the M building, sort of below the math building. And so the point I'm trying to get to is if somebody does the story wrong, you need to correct them right away. And it was a local TV station, and I knew this was going to happen. This was very lazy of them. So just to tell you the story really quickly, it was early in the morning. It was a skateboarder. You guys have all seen the signs, right, about don't skateboard. And the kid was being just awful to the officer, and the officer was trying to detain him to give him a warning, because we never, even though it says $300 fine, in the 6 years I've been there, I don't think we've ever given it to anybody. But the officer was trying to detain him and said, "You need to stop." And the kid's like, "No, I'm out of here. I'm not taking the warning." And there was profanity and everything. And the officer took the kid down, and the kid sort of got the best of the officer and had him in a headlock. And what the kid didn't know was across the street at those apartments, the DEA was issuing a search warrant for something. So there was like 19 officers across the street. Well, that guy hit the warning button, there was an officer in trouble, and before you know it, there was 20 on top of this kid, right? And it was kind of weird. While the officers were coming over, he was sort of, just like we see now, he was recording it, and it was quite amazing. He was recording it, and there was one faculty member saw it, one other student saw it. Those were the only two people that saw it, but he recorded it, and then he sent it right to Channel 10 as he was being wrestled down. So he was smart enough to, maybe smart enough's not the word, but he was, he could multitask enough to where he was in a headlock. He could upload to YouTube and send to Channel 10, right? And so then they get it and they see it. They don't call me at all to say what happened, right? And again, there was 2 witnesses, and then there was his video. And the kid was completely out of line, right? We kicked him out of school, and he just can't come back. And, even his parents were very mad, and it turns out his dad was a police officer, and it was not good. But he sent it to Channel 10, and then, Channel 10. So then they came to the campus with that video, and then rather than get any statement, rather than try and get the witnesses, they just did a story by showing that video to kids, right? And just said, well, what do you think? This is, police brutality and all that kind of stuff. And so it was just sort of the lazy reporter thing, right? When they did the story live and then moved on. And I was like, well, we need to correct this, because it wasn't about illegal skateboarding as much as it was resisting arrest and everything. The interesting thing about that story is that video became viral to where two sides took it, and all that kind of media that's not mainstream, all of a sudden they started to say, well, this kid was taken down because he was a DACA recipient, and Miramar College hates DACA recipients.
Oh.
And it was like, well, that damages your brand in a second. I mean, and it's like, and then the other side had, I don't remember what the other side was, some sort of police thing. It sort of was a microcosm of what's going on right now,
right.
But it happened a year ago. So unless you jump on that as long story to answer your question, but you need to jump on it right away and make sure that everyone has the understanding of what actually happened. And I will tell you, not a single, to this day, and that thing happened 18 months ago, no one has contacted me at all for any sort of statement or any sort of side of the story. So to answer your question, you do need to do crisis management, and you need to do it right away. And we should have, while I reached out to 10, our bosses at the district were like, just let it go. They've been real good to us. And then you see how it spirals into a DACA now, and it's
right.
So I get what you're at. You have to think what you say, and then if you do say the wrong thing or it's taken the wrong way, you need to jump on it and correct it. Not that anyone will accept your correction.
At least get it out there. Yeah, yes. Yeah. I remember one of the very first times I ever spoke to the media. I was telling a story, and I was saying that this person was the kind of person who he said something like, he doesn't let the facts get in the way of a good story. Yeah. Right. And so, but I was explaining that a person was saying that, and somebody else, and then they quoted me as saying, "Don't let the facts get in the way of a good story." And I was like, "No, I don't. That's not my opinion." So yeah. I really.
But it also goes back to that point I made earlier. Is like, you sort of need to read the room, right? And at this point, I wouldn't make a pitch that wasn't COVID related or social justice related in this environment, and I probably wouldn't even make the social justice one, to be quite honest with you. I probably would just make the COVID-19 one, and sometimes, you'll want to stay out of it. We've had that a lot at the district where we're just not going to have an opinion on something. Right. It's becoming harder nowadays because it seems like everybody wants to hear an opinion one way or the other. But there have been some times where we're going to sit this one out.
Yeah. So I see some more questions in the chat, and some people were wondering about contacting you if you want to. Sure. Make that okay.
Yeah, if you guys ever want to, just send me an email at squis@sdccd.edu.
I'll put that also in our class.
I saw someone about why you wouldn't pitch social. You can. It's up to you. I'm just saying sometimes we all have bosses, right? It goes back to managing the expectations of your bosses, and I'm down low here, right? So. It's got to come from the top down to do that. And that's why.
Maybe some things that at certain times you'll want to stay out of if they're too sticky or.
Yeah, I mean, there's obvious stuff, right? But I'm just saying from your business standpoint, do you want to get, just from a purely entrepreneurial standpoint, right? You want to get your business in the middle of something.
Yeah, it depends on whether or not you want to be associated with it, Heaven. And your business, you probably would, because that's what your business is about. So, sure. Yeah. And then I see a question also from Karina, who's asking about if you happen, if you have an example of a great pitch that you got, something that you were like, yes, thank you, you did it right.
Yeah, one of the ones was the first one that we ever had, our aviation program when I first started, rebuilt that Mustang. It was like a P-51 Mustang from World War II, and they were doing it because it was a Tuskegee Airman, African Americans that served in World War II, and this Tuskegee Airman was, it was like 93 or 94, So they were trying to rebuild this thing through the aviation department to get it to New Orleans to the World War II Museum, where they're going to honor the Tuskegee Airmen. And so we had to really race to get this done because he was in failing health. So we had that pitch. So we had everything, right? 93-year-old veteran, Tuskegee Airmen. I think even our freeway on 15 is right, Tuskegee Airmen Highway, right before the Air College side. And then, our students that just did this beautiful, they completely revamped this P-51 Mustang aircraft. And so like everybody wanted to do that story. Everybody did. And then it became a national story, right? Then when he went to New Orleans, then we were able to pitch the fact that it was at Miramar College, and it became a national story and all that good stuff. Yeah. And so we got a lot of bang for our buck out of that. So, and then I think he passed away like literally 4 days after he went to New Orleans and saw it. So it was like, even that then became became your feel good story. So that was probably our best pitch since
it checked all the boxes, right?
It checks out, yeah.
So I saw another question from Alex was asking about, you mentioned that there were a couple of good PR agencies here in San Diego. Would you be willing to share those, or? Yeah,
so the one girl I like the best, it's a young girl, her name is Sarah Wacker. I think it's Wacker, and she's really good at what she does, and she's got a good voice to the local news reporters. So I would definitely look into her. She's probably the best one.
Sarah Wacker. Okay. Thank you. And then I saw a question that I got privately. Somebody was wondering if everybody wouldn't mind taking a group photo with
Sure.
all of us here on here on the Zoom channel. And in order to do that, everyone, if you wouldn't mind turning on your camera, and we'll do a screenshot. And it's kind of last. Oh, that's funny. A few people actually asked to do this, so this is awesome. So if you could turn on your camera, and then if all of you who want to take a picture can take a picture, I'll also take one, and I'll count down. And everybody smile. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Cheese. Okay, I got the picture there.
Awesome.
And I think it probably came out good. Oh, I'll do one more. It looks like a couple more people just came on. So one more picture, and then 3, 2, 1, smile. Great, thanks everyone. So that's perfect. It looks like we're just about out of time. We just have a couple minutes left. So I'll pass it to you, Steve, if you want to kind of leave us with anything or a parting thought for all of us.
No, I appreciate your guys' time, and I look forward to everybody hopefully starting a very successful business, and look forward to you guys getting a lot of media attention for that business. And I wish you all the best success. I know it's tough times right now, but hang in there. It's going to get better, without question.
Thank you so much, Steve. I really appreciate it. And it's a real testament that we just planned this a couple of days ago. We had over 60 people come in, and so that's pretty awesome. Everybody was, I'm sure, grateful. I'm grateful. Lots of thanks out there. Thank you, Steve. And you'll be getting some press pitches from us very, very, very soon.
All right, cool.
All right, great.
Thank you, guys.
And we'll make sure they're good ones. All right, take care. Thank you so much,
Appreciate it.
everyone. Thank
Bye.
you. Okay, bye-bye.